Who's in charge here? Today we're going to look at authority, how it works in society and culture more broadly, and what we can learn about it from the history of religion. We're going to examine how it's created, how it's challenged, and how it's maintained, because it's your introduction to religious studies, and it's coming up right now. What is authority? What does it mean to have authority? In the academic study of religion, when we're talking about authority, we're looking at a discourse that takes shape within a community. And in that community, it seems as if there are certain people who are able to exert their force over another group of people or another set of people within that same community. And in fact, the people in the community understand that person to be in charge or to have the right proper claim to be able to exert their force. In other words, it's recognizing why and how it is that some people get to say, this is what happens in the life of our community. Craig Martin's going to help us understand how authority works. First, by looking at authority as something that is a relationship rather than an intrinsic or essential thing. And then secondly, he's going to help us look at some of the ways in which authority is created, challenged, and maintained. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and prepare to take notes. I'm going to show you two different models that are present within our textbook, and I'm going to give you prompts to sort of copy down charts that I've created, and then we'll go through these charts or models together so we can better understand how authority works, not only in the history of religion, but also in society and culture. In thinking about authority, for our purposes, it's important that we understand authority doesn't work as an essential, but rather as a relationship. Craig Martin is going to isolate this very idea by thinking about what he calls authority and audience, that you don't really have authority without the other. So authority and audience is what we're going to call this model. And what he argues is that if you were to break down any particular instance in which we see an authoritative figure in a community, there's going to be sort of a circular logic that governs the way in which that person is seen as having authority and how that person continues to receive or gain authority from their audience. So you can really start out, I think, in any given place, but traditionally, I think a lot of people are going to understand this model working by starting out with this first box at the top, the project values onto authoritative figure. So imagine this. You have a person who is seen within the community as being worth emulating, worth copying. They are seen as a figure who is of great importance and value to the community. That's going to beget more statements about that person's values and perspective, right? They're going to, once you're understood to be great in one way, people are going to say more great things about you. And in fact, as a result of that, because you're popular, because you're well-liked, people are going to accept values attributed to you because you're authoritative. Right? So if you're seen great in one way, you're going to be seen great in other ways, and the things that you say are going to be seen as great as well. This is going to lead people to see you as even more of a great person, or see you as more of an authoritative figure, because you're not only a one-hit wonder, you're great for so many reasons now. And people are going to study your words, they're going to hang on to that, and continue to reinforce that authority, projecting it onto you, which continues that cycle of projecting more values on you because you're an authoritative figure. So we might think about this in terms of the history of religion in light of an example. So I'm going to use an example from Islam, actually. I'm going to talk about the Prophet Muhammad. But first I'm going to talk about Muhammad himself. So the name Muhammad in Arabic comes from the root for the word praiseworthy. Muhammad is understood from birth as praiseworthy. Now this isn't all that special or significant, especially if you think about our own naming practices, right? Some people will have names that mean something, especially in another language. And it could be that the parents like the name for the way it rings, the way it sort of rolls off the tongue, but sometimes they like the meaning behind that language. and want to put that out into the universe in hopes that that child will embody the values or ideas of it. So, my first name is Richard. Richard means king. Was I born a king? Absolutely not. Did my parents wish me to have a great life? Maybe. And maybe that's the causality behind why they named me Richard. Now, the fact of the matter is I'm a junior and my father was named Richard. And so maybe it was his parents that named him Richard because they wanted him to be kingly. And of course, there was a King Richard in England. So the ways we might begin to think about how and why someone is authoritative or of value or is given statements of value can lead us into all sorts of directions. But that very act of classification is where this all starts. Once someone is classified as being great, we begin to think about how they continue to be great. So Muhammad is born with the name of praiseworthy or trustworthy, and then in his lifetime, in fact, in his childhood, he's understood to be a sort of prodigy. He's understood to relate to people well. He's understood to be smart. He's understood to be very fair. He's given a lot of responsibility as a young person, working as a trader, brokering deals between tribes. So all of this adds to the lore about Muhammad being a praiseworthy individual. Additionally, as Muhammad grows older, according to Islam, we learn that he understands that there are problems in the world, problems in fact, the city of Mecca, where he observes and he notes that Mecca is often ruled by unfairness, it's ruled by the wealthy, there's violence, there are things that need to be worked out and dealt with. It's too busy, there's too much hustle and bustle, and so Muhammad would step back from all of that and go sort of meditate and pray in the cave until he has an encounter with an angel from God who says, recite this, say this, these words from God. And then Muhammad comes to be understood as a sort of a messenger of God, speaking to the people what God's will is for them. Now, whenever someone says they can speak on behalf of God, in most cases, an audience is going to think of them as crazy, right? Insane, out of their mind. But if the figure is understood to be authoritative, if they are praised for one reason, then praised for more reasons, odds are they're going to continue to be praised. And in fact, Muhammad is seen as having said these words, and some people disagree with them, and some people think he's out of his mind. Most people do, but those close to him, his inner circle, begin to see him as maybe he's onto something. He's someone who's not just coming up with good ideas, maybe he's presenting divine ideas, and his authority is reinforced. Not only in that community, but in the communities with which Muhammad continues to work, those outside of his inner circle, they begin to see him as being useful, his words making a great deal of sense and helping them out. And as a result, people outside of his inner circle continue to project values onto his authoritative figure. He becomes known as a prophet, he becomes known as a messenger, and the cycle continues on and on and on. Muhammad's words get recorded down into text because they're not just his words, they're God's words, and they become a scripture, part of the very cultural toolbox, not only of his inner circle, not only of his family, not only of his tribe, not only of his clan, not only of all the people in Arabia, but worlds of people on almost every continent to this day, 1400 years later. Because of this circle of authority and the relationship between authorities and audience. That's how that works. So take a look at Craig Martin's chapter, particularly page 130, to see how this authority and audience model works. And then we're going to look at some other models that help us understand how authority is challenged and maintained. As we deconstruct the notion of authority, we begin to see a number of tropes or patterned ways in which people appeal to this discourse for their own purposes, whether it's to create authority, to maintain authority, or as we'll see, challenge authority. So the first of which that I want to discuss today with you is the idea of returning to origins. Returning to origins is whenever you want to go back to the beginning of things. It's the good old days, okay? Anytime someone says they want to go back to the good old days, they are returning to a sense of origins in which what happened before is better than now. It also sets up a sort of historical precedent for one's claims toward how the future should be. And it's also worth noting that given what we've studied so far and how social stratification works, the good old days aren't always good for everybody, right? If you think about going back to the good old days of the founding fathers in the United States of America, you're going to leave out a whole bunch of people who see themselves as tried and true Americans today. This is the problem of the return to origins notion, is that it always is going to bring in with it certain stratification that people are going to try and overlook whenever they make this appeal. Another appeal that people make in sort of articulating their sense of authority as being particularly valid is to draw upon what's called false universalism. And this is what we see whenever someone says that the idea that they're presenting is shared by a whole host of people. It's the sort of everyone agrees. Everyone does this. Even people who would usually disagree with your claim, they largely will at least agree with part of it, and thus, as a result, the ideas that you're presenting are all good. So an example of this in the history of religions would be that you should treat others the way you should be treated, right? The golden rule. And as a result, if you're saying, well, everyone agrees with the golden rule, and thus our tradition and our particular prophet is valid for that reason, that's forgetting the fact that the other traditions don't agree with probably the rest of the statements about your prophet, the prophet's teachings, or the customs and ideas that you maintain in your cultural toolbox. They have other ways of doing things. They're probably going to disagree with you on those. And just because they agree with you on one doesn't mean they're going to agree with you on the others or your whole program. So false universalism is when you try to sneak in the value of your claim by honing in on the one thing that everyone or a whole host of people will agree on. Now, authority works in part because authoritative figures are seen as mirrors of society. They are the best of society. They are exemplars. They are who we want, and I'm going to put in parentheses, to be. Authoritative figures represent all that a community wants to project. And as so far as one can claim to do so, they can maintain their status as an authority. So this is the what would Jesus do kind of claim, which Martin actually gives you a whole case study on the history of that very phrase. The idea of saying Jesus exemplifies all that the Christian community is and wants to be means that in order to orient the community, we look to Jesus as a authoritative figure and a mirror of who we want to be, even in situations that are far beyond the moment, time, geography, context that Jesus would have been a part. So that's the sort of notion of authoritative figure as mirror. Think about the way in which people, authoritative figures, reflect the best of a society. That claim. Now, we've already talked about authority and audience as inherently relational. That's that chart that we broke down just a little bit ago. So if you have questions about how that works, of course, go back and rewind this video so you can see how that works. I want to move here now to selective privileging, which is another way that audiences are able to sort of maintain projecting their values upon an authoritative figure. And what this is the sort of picking and choosing that communities and figures do, picking and choosing in defending their claims, in justifying their programs, and in referencing their sources. So think about when people, groups, use their cultural toolbox. And their cultural toolbox, say their sacred texts, their scriptures, include verses that aren't particularly savory. Maybe a group is left out in discussions of origins, or something in their text from a long time ago allows for a practice that we would no longer do, like maybe polygamy or child abuse or heavily patriarchal ideas. Like, these are things that are often in ancient text and are allowed for, but in modernity we wouldn't hold for that, most likely. Well, the idea that you can sort of pick and choose which things apply and which things don't, that's selective privileging. And everyone does this, right? This is why cultural toolboxes are so useful, is because what comes with them are people who know how to use them and apply them in the right circumstances. But picking and choosing is something that we see as a practice that has to be done if you want to maintain authority. Also, someone who wants to maintain authority has to be able to deal with challenges to authority. Now, challenges to authority come part and parcel to any sort of claim of we're right, they're wrong, or we have the right to say how things should go in our community. Challenging authority means that someone else is wrong. One of the best ways to gain authority is by challenging someone else's authority, right? We see this with every presidential election. We see this with every reform movement. And in fact, in the history of religions, we see this time and time again, in which a group breaks off from a larger group because they say we need to do it differently. Their authority is lost. Here's the way we should do it, and here's the person we should follow to do it. Think about Christianity breaking away from Judaism. Think about Judaism breaking away from a whole bunch of Canaanite and Semitic traditions. Think about Islam and its building off of Christianity, Judaism, Arabian traditions before it. Think about Baha'i breaking off of all of those. Think about the way that Buddhism breaks off of Hinduism. I mean, these sort of relationships in which someone says, this is right, but it's also wrong, and here's how we should go forward doing it, is that challenge to authority. And it's a great way to rise up and take authority in a community. You see this anytime a president tries to, or anytime a candidate for presidential office goes up against an incumbent. They will challenge the current president's authority, and they will say, this is what we should do instead, as a way of trying to get authority. Now, if one is the authoritative figure, one is the incumbent, or hopes to be the incumbent, then they need to be able to learn how to respond to challenges that come from other people, that come from within, and that come with working out their own praxis as leaders. So this has to do with challenges that come from within, without, and as part of practice or the job. So anytime you see someone having to deal with hard situations, right, those are opportunities where someone has to exercise their authority. And if they're successful, then the audience is going to project more authority and value on them. If they're not successful, then their authority is going to be challenged, and they will likely lose authority or lose some of the value that the audience has projected upon them. So return to origins, false universalism, authoritative figures as mirrors, authority and audience, selective privileging, challenging authority, responding to challenges. You want to know what all of these terms are so that you can deconstruct how authority works in any given case study, whether it's of your choosing or someone else's. And in order to understand these phrases and see how they work and even get more examples, take a look at Martin's chapter. He discusses all of these phrases throughout. And they will help you get to where you want to go in your study of religion. The key to understanding authority in light of a critical study of religion is that authority is a discourse. And it's a discourse that draws upon all the other things that we've learned this semester. The ability to define, the ability to classify and categorize, to draw upon essentials, even though one understands that these processes are always dynamic and involve other people. As you hold yourself to understanding authority as always an interaction between someone who claims to have value and the people who project value on them, the audience, you will understand how authority works, why authority doesn't always work, and what it takes to continue to maintain such authority. Martin's breakdown of how authority works and all those tropes that go with it will help you stay honest in analyzing all that people are up to when they take value for themselves and exert force upon and over others.